Now, I'm going to start this video out by sharing some quotes taken from the recently released book after it saw about a 3-month delay, The Art of Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. And they're made by Chris Terrio, who, if you don't know, co-wrote the script for Episode 9 along with J.J. Abrams. Anyway, he said, "I've never rewritten a film as much as this one. It's like a tide. There's a new script every morning, but we just keep going at it, loosely thinking that it's not good enough. It's never good enough. Luckily, the production team is so good that they can shift and adjust. We're course correcting as we go. We're trying things, and some things don't work, and some things aren't ambitious enough. Some things are overly ambitious. Some things are too dense. Some things are too simple. Some things are too nostalgic. Some things are too out of left field. We're finding our balance." And though there's quite a few things we can take away from what he said there, the last part, where he talks about all the things they were trying to avoid in search of balance, describes what we actually got with The Rise of Skywalker almost perfectly, I feel. Because you see, I watched the movie again last night. It just came out on home disc, and I've long since had it ordered, and yes, you can call me a fool for buying it or giving Disney my money, but Star Wars is literally what I do for a living, not to mention I own all the other movies, and I'm a bit of a completionist. Anyway, I watched it again last night, looking at it as objectively as possible. And afterwards, I just couldn't find the right words to describe it until, ironically enough, I came across these quotes from Terrio and I thought, my god, he nails it perfectly here. Somehow this movie is everything and nothing at the same time. It's both too much and too little. It's massive in scope and scale, tries to convince you that the stakes have never been higher, but underneath that there's not much there, not much you really care about. There's only one character moment that really strikes a chord with me after seeing the film a few times now in total, and that's the scene between Han and his son Ben. I think it works and works well, mainly because it's one of the few times the movie slows down to try and be something more than just wall-to-wall action with plot conveniences to move it along. It also doesn't hurt that these are two amazing actors being allowed to just do their thing. And I actually do like how it mirrors the scene in The Force Awakens when Han is killed by Ben, or Kylo Ren. But that scene, of course, basically happens at the end of the second act, and I feel like their goal with the third act was to cram as much stuff into it as possible. It was like they were playing a game of how many ships can we get on the screen at the same time, because in their mind, more ships means bigger stakes and leads to a better film, somehow. But instead, it just ends up feeling so ridiculous and out of place, so huge that it feels like nothing actually matters. Not to mention, they spent the first two films of the trilogy showing us that the First Order in itself is a great and menacing threat that we see, or have it implied, is taking over the galaxy, only to then show us in the third movie that there was this other massive fleet out there, and a scheme or plan in place to take over the galaxy that doesn't hinge on the First Order and what they've previously done or are currently doing, which in the end renders the First Order and everything they'd accomplished an utterly irrelevant afterthought. And how silly is it that the First Order, again, this faction that was the main threat for the first two movies, is basically taken care of by a line of dialogue when Finn says people are rising up all over the galaxy, and then we get a couple shots of First Order ships in familiar locations being blown up. Well, I guess it's as silly as one line in the opening crawl of The Last Jedi, telling us they took over in the first place, especially when, at any point I'd imagine, the galaxy could have risen up to stop them. I mean, look at all those ships that Lando was able to rally in a matter of hours, the ones that showed up at Exegol, I mean. That fleet alone, assembled on a whim really, could have easily overrun the First Order at any point. And just think of how many ships weren't there that couldn't assemble that quickly. And don't try and tell me the First Order prevented them from doing that before, considering they are still in control of the galaxy at this point, and that fleet assembled anyway. And now imagine they had a couple days or weeks to amass even more ships and to get more organized. The First Order never stood a chance the whole damn time. And so it's just baffling to me that this is what they came up with after extensive rewrites, that there was seemingly this list of things they wanted to avoid, yet it feels like they nailed each and every one of them. And anyone out there who still thinks there was some grand plan in place needs to let that idea go. Clearly, by their own admission here, they were just trying to figure out what would work, not that they had a clear and true vision for the movie. Not to mention, it has very little to do with the previous movies in the trilogy. Kylo Ren is the supreme leader now, which is one of the main things The Last Jedi set up, but he's immediately basically working for Palpatine, who is promising him an empire when I thought he already had one at this point with the First Order. But again, the First Order doesn't really matter in this movie. Nothing that happened before matters when you introduce Palpatine and a whole new type of threat, that being the Sith fleet and their planet-killing weapons. Again, this movie is just so big and full of stuff that it's insane, really. And in an odd sort of way, I feel like the original trilogy almost benefits from the fact that it was limited by the technology of its day. Lucas literally couldn't put 1,000 Star Destroyers on screen and then have, I don't know, a few thousand other ships show up to fight them, like we see in the Rise of Skywalker. And so the battles in those films, like the space battle over Endor, have a more personal and intimate feeling to them. The Rise of Skywalker is just ships everywhere. In the prequels then, Lucas certainly went bigger, and I do think, if we're being fair, he does get a bit caught up in the technology at times. But I don't think he ever takes it to ridiculous levels. I think the prequels and the Clone Wars series, for the most part, do a good job of showing what a galactic scale conflict would or should look like in the Star Wars galaxy. The prequels really put the wars in Star Wars, in a good way, and though we see some large-scale battles, none of them feel so big that they just look silly. You might say the battle over Coruscant, which is at the start of Episode 3, but that battle is the culmination of a 3-year war, not a battle that happens when a bunch of ships being built in secret are suddenly attacked by a massive fleet assembled in 5 hours. Anyway, I don't want this video to run too long or to go too far down the rabbit hole. I mostly just wanted to give my general thoughts about The Rise of Skywalker after watching it again and having some time to really think about it after the first viewing. And though I still think it's a somewhat enjoyable movie when just watched as is, and when taken out of the context of the whole Skywalker saga, and that it wraps up the story of some of the characters, the new characters, fairly well. As for the conclusion to the sequel trilogy on the whole, something I've said before, I thought it did a pretty good job of. I don't quite feel that way anymore. After watching this movie again, it really feels like it has so very little to do with the previous 2 films in the trilogy. Nothing we've seen before matters. Learning that Rey was nobody? Yeah, that gets changed. The First Order ruling the galaxy? Yeah, they get dealt with by a line of dialogue. Luke's idea that the Jedi should end? Yeah, he basically admits he was being an idiot in the last film. Kylo ascending to the position of Supreme Leader? That doesn't matter because a new villain, or an old one, is going to be inserted into the story for him to have to sort of be subservient to. As for who Snoke was, his story is pretty irrelevant because he's just a puppet of Palpatine's that he made in a vat, and again, the main villain was supposedly Palpatine all along. And these are just a few examples and leaves alone how poorly this final movie in the sequel trilogy ties into the first 2 trilogies of this story. You could also probably skip 7 and 8 and just watch this one and more or less be okay. There's also the fact that this is, or was, the Skywalker saga, yet ends with a Palpatine saving the day and taking their name. Okay, I'm done here. Again, I watched the movie again last night, and to be honest, I didn't feel angry or anything like that. I still don't hate this movie. It was mostly just disappointment that I felt while watching, that this was the best they could come up with, even though they admit they tried so damn hard and kept writing and rewriting and working on this story. It just feels like their final solution was to have it move so fast and to throw a ton of crap on screen, and they just hoped it would cover up how hollow the story actually was. And as I always say, and I know it drives some of you crazy that I always do, but if you liked this movie or you love the whole sequel trilogy, that's great. I wish I did too. I wish all or most fans were celebrating how amazing it was and looking forward to the future of the franchise with nothing but optimism. But I can't help but look back at this trilogy and think what could have been. I can't help but wonder what the Lucas trilogy would have been like, or what if they'd used the EU as an outline for this, or what if it'd just been better planned out by other people entirely. And yes, that's basically what my poll question is this week, and if you'd like to vote and give your thoughts on all this, a link to it can be found in the description below. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Sorry for the slightly incoherent video, but I just wanted to talk about watching this movie again. Now I'm curious if anyone out there has watched it again, or if you've watched it multiple times, and if your opinion on it is changing for the better or worse. Either way, leave a comment below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.